Greetings, friends of liberty. When we examine the decline of any religion in any country, we can see, by my understanding, that there can only be two potential causes. First, A religion may decline because people simply don't want or feel like believing anymore. And B, secondly, a religion may decline because violence is used against its practitioners to inhibit the exercise of their rites and rituals, or even to kill them. One or the other, or both. Now, when we examine the decline of Protestantism amongst our friendly Gallic garlic eaters, we see overwhelmingly the second mechanism at work: violence on the part of the French state and Frenchies in general against the Protestants, the Huguenots. Protestantism all started in France in the 16th century, of course, with the followers of John Calvin, they adopting their name from the burgomaster of Geneva, Besançon-Hugues. Later in the 17th century, when France added Alsace in 1648 by the Treaty of Westphalia, and the city of Strasbourg as well, it gained a few tens of thousands of Lutherans, but otherwise all the French Protestants were Calvinists, Huguenots. As the Reformed religion of Calvin became increasingly popular, especially during the 16th century, and amongst a significant group of nobles, their strength grew to perhaps 10 to 15% of the entire population by 1572. But then, on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, various Catholic nobles, militant factions, and perhaps the royal family itself, led by the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and King Charles IX, ordered or stood by as thousands of Huguenots, prominent and otherwise, were slaughtered in Paris, all of them, from the point of view of the intensely Papist Parisian population, gathered together in one convenient location. And to these thousands murdered were added thousands or tens of thousands more over the next month in the provinces. This act of religious extirpation, not at all surprising, given the inherent violence of the Froggies, and naturally intensified even further in that city more French than any other, was understandably taken as a distinct omen, whether supernatural or otherwise, by the Huguenots, that the time had come for their departure. And so many migrated en masse to England, the Netherlands, and various states of Germany. Thankfully, we here in England accorded them the greatest hospitality, and made very good use of them indeed, they excelling in their chosen professions of jewellery making, clock-making, silver-smithing, and silk weaving. Now if we turn to the evident decline of other religions in other regions of the world, even extending to your own 21st century in parts of the Middle East, we find today the provocative history of the decline of Eastern Christianity in Muslim lands in Bat Yeor's The Decline of Eastern Christianity Under Islam. Miss Yeor, the pen name for Gisele Littman, has written many works about the nature and treatment of Islam's subject population, the dhimmis, and in this work combines them historically in one comprehensive treatment. She begins by outlining her objective: the study of that multitude of peoples subjugated by Islam, to determine as far as possible the complex processes that brought about their gradual extinction. These people included A, the Zoroastrians in Persia, B, Nestorian Christians in Babylonia, Bahrain, and Oman, and C, the Jews. Interestingly, before the arrival of Muhammad's armies, various Eastern religions, such as the Copts in Egypt, the Syriac Church in Antioch, and the Armenian Church in Turkey, were persecuted by the Byzantines and their Eastern Orthodoxy, which made these people not reluctant to betray it when finally Muhammad's armies arrived. In addition to this persecution, Yeor makes the interesting argument that the very persecutory Byzantine law codes that had been used on the Copts, Armenians, and others before the arrival of Islam were later incorporated into the Islamic law codes themselves, contributing to a substantial portion of their intolerance. Returning to the Islamic conquest, the procession of their armies was brutal and violent. Of the very first town conquered, Medina, their Jewish men slaughtered and women and children reduced to slavery. This predatory treatment, customary among the Bedouins of Arabia and fully allowed by Muhammad, was justified by Allah's revelations inscribed in the Quran and became normative and obligatory in the strategy of jihad. Even treaties negotiated with the conquered people could be abrogated at will by Muslims if they felt like it. Partly, Islam gained popularity among these desert tribes of Arabia precisely because it allowed and justified the theft of land and goods and the enslavement of conquered peoples. Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, consolidated his hold over various Bedouin tribes and then conquered regions outside of Arabia proper, and his successor, Ibn al-Khattab, drove the remaining Christians and Jews out of Arabia altogether. The process of jihad, never ending for 1,400 years now, had begun. Wherever the early Islamic armies went, whether to Babylonia, Egypt, Syria, or Armenia, unless a town chose to submit first before battle had been joined, it and its people were treated as pure booty. The majority of the villages fell into the category of conquest without treaty. The absence of a treaty allowed the massacre or enslavement of the conquered population and the division of their property. The Muslims proceeded onwards to raid and conquer much of Spain, and in France, Narbonne across the Spanish border, and raiding far up the Rhone River Valley at times, reaching Avignon 30 miles inland. Time and again, the historical record shows the destructive nature of jihad. Booty, the fifth part of levies on harvests, and the fate of populations, conversion, massacre, slavery, or tribute. However, it is important to note that this destructive raiding was the common practice of many armies during this period, whether Slav, Latin, or Greek, with the Muslims only being distinguished by the thoroughness of their brutality. The Turks joined the Arabs, becoming Islamicized from the 8th to 11th centuries, they then lending their own predatory instincts to the whole Islamic enterprise. Notably, among the Turks, the custom of devshirme, the practice of stealing Christian children and raising them as slave soldiers called janissaries, started in the 14th century. Yet another significant and destructive phenomenon during the first centuries that Yeor notes is the continuous migration of whole Arabian tribes with their flocks, often hostile to one another and often directed towards specific conquered regions. In Palestine and Syria, tribes from Yemen and nomads from Hijaz settled in the towns and countryside where they took over houses and lands. The consequences of this, A, continuous anarchy, as the tribes, very small in number compared to the subject populations, raided peaceful villages for booty. B, the conflict engendered amongst themselves by how the booty taken should be divided between them and the Islamic State. C, the destruction of large areas of productive farmland. D, the fleeing of rural populations either to other villages and towns or into the mountains to escape. And E, the resulting depopulation of many areas, also because so many captive slaves were taken. In Egypt, the peasants, suffering under extreme taxation and fleeing the countryside, were forced to return, their children often taken as slaves or for various types of forced labor at seaports. As a result, both of the tribal migrations and the slow conversion over the next centuries of the native populations and sometimes their elites to Islam, the ethno-religious map of Islam was completely altered around the 10th and 11th centuries. Exterminated or exiled by religious persecution, Zoroastrians only survived in scattered and insignificant groups. The millions of Copts, Syriac monophysites, Jews, and Nestorians who had populated the prosperous towns and fertile countryside of those vast territories were reduced in varying proportions to urban communities. Later on, when Constantinople fell in 1453, 50 to 60,000 people were enslaved and deported. The deserted city was then repopulated with thousands of Muslims, Christians, and Jews transferred from different provinces of the empire. Given that the elites of the native subjugated populations generally had a much higher level of civilization, culture, and education than their desert Arab or Turkish masters, potentially much of the flowering and alleged brilliance of Islamic civilization, so often proclaimed by commentators of its golden age, actually may have come instead from the brilliance of the dhimmi elites who became Muslim or worked for the Muslims. As Eura says, scribes, secretaries, treasurers, accountants, architects, craftsmen, peasants, doctors, scholars, diplomats, translators, and politicians, the Christians form the base, the texture, the elite, and the sinews of the Muslim empire. And administratively, it was they who were the most merciless persecutors of their fellow countrymen and former co-religionists. It was they who contributed most signally to the organization, extension, and consolidation of the Ottoman state. Monsieur summarizes this issue by saying, the contrast between the nomadic wretchedness with its cultural poverty on the one hand, and on the other, the prodigious material and cultural wealth, arts, sciences, and literature of the Judeo-Christians and Persians was counterbalanced by the Arab sense of racial superiority. The types of confiscatory taxation levied on dhimmi populations were many and varied. A land tax, kharaj, later also exacted from the monasteries, provisions in kind proportioned to harvests, a poll tax, jizya, levied on adult men, and often accompanied by the application of torture, a tax covering the expenses and maintenance of the tax collectors, and a general sum devoted to requisitions, extraordinary taxes, and the upkeep and clothing of Muslims. 5 types in total. In addition, the dhimmi population was indiscriminately requisitioned for buildings, roads, and navigation requirements, including naval forces. In order to force payment of taxes, sometimes the whole population of a village, Christians, Jews, and Arabs, were kept in a church for several days without food till a ransom was paid. Among the many additional injustices experienced by dhimmis were that A, the court system didn't accept their testimony, B, they were often accused arbitrarily of the capital crime of blasphemy, although if you had enough money, large bribes might save your life, C, a ban on Christians, Jews, and others building new places of worship, D, turning mosques into churches, E, the plundering of monasteries, F, the repair of churches and synagogues only upon the paying of a big bribe to the Sultan, G, capital punishment if a dhimmi entered a mosque, H, the forbidding of dhimmi men of having sexual relations with Muslim women, I, in some countries making dhimmis extract the brains and salt the decapitated heads of criminals, which they then exposed upon the walls of the town. J, forcing Jews to amputate the hands of thieves. K, often forbidding dhimmis from using horses or camels. L, the practice of stipulating that dhimmi houses have a really low door, forcing them to stoop to gain access to their residence. M, often forbidding dhimmi populations from wearing shoes. N, in some places forbidding the carrying of arms. O, in Yemen, forcing the Jews to clean the latrines and remove dead animals. P, preying on Christian pilgrims and Christians congregating for religious festivals. Q, taking so many people captive in some communities that it was impossible to ransom them all from slavery. And R, again, the so-called custom of Dev Shirmi, introduced by the Ottoman Sultan Orklan, 1326-59, of a fifth of the Christian children from conquered Balkan regions. This practice continued until the 18th century. As time went on and the West became more powerful, countries like France in the 1500s were able to demand protection of Christian pilgrims and populations. Later in the 19th century, Turkey became more protective of Jews under England's watchful eye, and European countries contributed with treaties towards protecting dhimmi Christian populations. And once the revolutionary ideals of the Enlightenment spread to the Greeks, the Serbs, and others, those dhimmis were inspired to increasingly resist the injustices and their lack of national sovereignty. More religious Muslims responded to these developments by blaming the Sultan for obeying foreign courts and transgressing Islamic laws, which had secured the lightning victories of triumphant Islam. In addition, the ideology of pan-Islamism emerged, which, contrary to Ottomanism, which expressed a unified secular nationalism, glorified the supremacy of Islam and the values of Jihad. As the majority populations in Greece and Serbia became more and more rebellious, some 3 million Muslims flowed back, wave after wave, from the liberated European countries, settling in Asian Turkey and its Arab provinces. Of course, the reactionary impulses of fundamentalist Islam soon led to one of the greatest genocides of the 20th century, the Turkish slaughter of 1 million Armenians from 1915 to 1917. Although Yor argues that without World War I, this genocide would not have occurred, she also says the genocide of the Armenians was the natural outcome of a policy inherent in the politico-religious structure of Dhimmitude. Summarizing the harms, she argues that some of the more serious sociological ones flowing from being a dhimmi and living in a dhimmi community were A, the corruption of the communities engendered since Christian and Jewish community leaders were tempted to enrich themselves by administering their community's fiscality. The promise of a patriarchate to an ambitious dissident, the grant of a church or monastery belonging to a rival sect, or the protection of churches in return for a denunciation of the policy of Byzantium or Rome, all were methods of applying pressure. B, another harm was that the many different minority communities often came to hate each other. As Yor says, the Jews would rejoice at the massacre of the Christians who persecuted them. The Christians would applaud the elimination of the Jews whom they hated. The Copts and Armenians would congratulate themselves on the enslavement of the Greeks, and the Greeks would find consolation for their humiliation in the abolition of the Serbian and Bulgarian churches. So, for example, in Egypt, the Greek governor Cyrus, who was also the Melkite patriarch, had subjected the Copts to a reign of terror for a decade. Using torture, the seizure of churches, and persecution, he strove to bring the monophysite clergy of Egypt under the control and authority of the Constantinople Patriarchate. At times, for example, under the Byzantine Emperor Leo the Isaurian, Nestorian Christians, Jews, and others actually migrated into Islamic areas because of more tolerant treatment. Ms. Yor concludes by listing what she regards as the core sociological attributes of dhimmitude, characterized by 3 factors. Number 1, it affects any human group victimized by jihad, irrespective of ethnic or social particularisms. Number 2, it covers a vast, almost unlimited geographical extent. And number 3, its durability. It is perpetuated for centuries. And it took centuries to occur because it took time for populations to be affected and changed by their treatment. So, for example, 3 centuries after the first Arab invasions, the decline of Christianity was particularly apparent in North Africa, where the number of bishoprics diminished from 500 to about 40. I would give this an A-, but while I certainly agree with her overall approach here and suspect that Islam is more intolerant than many historians believe, I'm a little cautious that her own animus against Islam, which I certainly share, hasn't perhaps led her to some minor errors. So, for example, she argues that the Armenians, victims of their forced alliance with Russia, were sacrificed by the Allies. The dhimmi peoples were scarcely more than pawns, cynically manipulated or abandoned on the international chessboard on which the states were playing out their cruel games. Overall, she blames the Armenian genocide on A, the very nature of Dhimmitude, B, the outbreak of World War I, as previously mentioned, and C, the alleged indifference of the Allies. But I don't know that this is fair to the Allies, who did care that the Armenians were slaughtered, but simply couldn't do that much about it. B, she seems to shy away from the issue of judging how intolerant or tolerant Muslims were. The only solution to judging how intolerant overall the Muslims were, which was likely very intolerant, is to create some kind of comparative index of brutality and then compare different regions. So, for example, was Spain, with its alleged golden age, relatively more tolerant to dhimmis? She doesn't examine Spain at all, so can't refute it or put its alleged tolerance into context. C, she also cites sources which say that the Dev-Shirmi system, by which Christian children were stolen from their parents, captured 1 in 5 children, at least in some areas, whereas others argue that the overall rate of child kidnapping was much lower, perhaps about 1 in 40. Happy for my part that my England is becoming ever more tolerant regarding religion, and that now and again we even contemplate getting rid of the 1671 Test Act, which requires those holding political office to renounce their Catholicism and belong to the Anglican Church. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.